something I'm really excited about. I want to try and cover 3 things today. So first up, I want to give you an introduction to server-side Swift. I want to talk about my journey coming from an iOS background into Vapor development, which is a web framework for server-side Swift. And I want to talk about my experiences running Vapor in production for the past 6 months or so. First off, raise of hands, how many in here are Swift developers? So the majority, it's good to see. All right, let's get to it. So I think a lot of us remembers this moment where Craig went onto the stage and introduced this new programming language. It was the Objective-C without the C. It was safe, it was reliable, it was drawing inspiration from other languages. And I was really excited about this moment. So that happened in June 2014 at WWDC. And around 1.5 years later, with the release of Swift 2.2, this happened. So Swift became open source. I think that was a really big moment. They also released the Swift Package Manager. This was together with the Swift 2.2, as far as I remember. But I want to emphasize the last bullet on that list. So it now meant that we're able to run Swift on Linux. And it kind of opened up this new dimension for Swift as a programming language, because we are now able to run this language on the server and now potentially have it as a backend language. So this led, obviously, to the rise of Swift web frameworks. These were the big ones. From left to right, we have Zevo, drawing inspiration from the Go language. We have Vapor, drawing inspiration from the Laravel framework in PHP. We have Perfect, and we have Couture. They all kind of try to solve the same problem, but taking different approaches. But they also share some pros and cons. And I want to walk you through some of them as I see it. But first up, how many have tried any of these frameworks? A couple. Anyone deployed something to production? 1. Anyone using this as their full-time job? There's room for improvement, I would say. All right, let's go through some of the pros of choosing Swift as your server-side language. First up, we have the Swift language in itself. It's modern, it's good, it has some good language features. I think it scores pretty high among developers in terms of satisfaction. It's fast, it outperforms other languages, it outperforms as a language in itself, but also if we take into account the different web frameworks compared to web frameworks written in other languages. It also has a low memory footprint that makes it ideal when we kind of want to deploy something to the cloud, because we're going to pay for that performance, we're going to pay for that memory we're going to use. Chris Bailey did a couple of talks about this, if you want to look further into the benchmarks of Swift as a server-side language. There's this idea about code reuse. It was something I started thinking about at the very first thing when we talked about having Swift on the server. This idea about sharing code between the backend and now the iOS application. I think the most classic example I hear a lot about is, for example, have your models being shared across. But we can also start to think about encapsulating business logic and sharing that across the 2 different platforms. We can also take it one step further and talk about how we could perhaps write all the endpoints on the backend, export that as a library, include that in the iOS app, and not having to deal with requests or network and whatnot. That, of course, also has some downsides to it, but it's an interesting thought. I think this area has a lot of room for exploration still. I think when we start to see the Swift Package Manager on iOS, I think it's becoming even more interesting. So one thing is being able to share code across the 2 platforms, but there's also the other side to it, that is being able to share the developers across the 2 platforms. As a company, you're now able to easily, or you're becoming more flexible, because you can move people around on the 2 different platforms, because they can share the knowledge on the language across the 2 different platforms. It makes your company a bit more flexible, depending on what comes in your pipeline. We have Xcode. I personally have a love-hate relationship to Xcode, I would say, but it also has a lot of good things in it. Great debugging tools, great profiling tools. We're also tapping into a rather big community, so we already have different platforms using Swift. We have iOS, for example. And even though we're going to write code on different platforms or using different frameworks, there's still all the language knowledge we're able to share. I also want to say that depending on what you value as a developer or what you value as a company, but there's also the ability to be able to contribute to this development. It's still very early days, both for the language, for the framework, for the whole idea of having it on a server. But if you value that as a developer or as a company, it might attract you more talent, then that's also something to consider. To summarize, we have the Swift language in itself. It's fast. We're able to share code. We can potentially have more full-stack developers. There's the Xcode IDE. There's the big community using Swift. And you're able to be part of the development of this. Let's have a look at some of the cons of using Swift on the server. So Swift, it's also a con, I would say. So we've all been through migration pains. Compilation times could be better. There's the whole evolution process, which I think overall is a really nice thing, but it also can be frustrating to see changes going in and then being reverted later on. There's the Swift package manager. I think we've come a long way, but it's not as mature as some of the other package managers you would see in other frameworks. There's misleading errors. There's the never-ending resolving of your packages. The syntax for the package manifest file changes. There's the framework in itself. Obviously, it's not going to be as mature and battle-tested as some of the other frameworks on different using different languages. And also, I would actually also say that since everything is moving this fast right now, all the resources tend to become outdated. So going from Vapor 1 to Vapor 2, for example, that's a pretty big step, and the resources written for Vapor 1 might be that relevant anymore for Vapor 2, and that's also something you're going to struggle with. It's the Xcode. For me, at least, it feels unstable. It's misleading error messages. We're still missing some refactoring tools, I would say. And I think overall we could benefit a lot from a more flexible plugin system. I think Xcode 9 went in a really nice direction. I like where they're going, but I think it could improve. At some point, when you've developed your backend project, you're going to deploy it somewhere so people can start using your application. And your options for deploying your project is also going to be limited because it hasn't been around for the same amount of time as some of the other big languages and other big web frameworks. Even though we have Bluemix or Vapor Cloud, it's still going to be limited in terms of options. There's also some quirks when deploying to Linux, so when you want to run Swift on Linux, but I'll get back to that. Lastly, I want to mention that the libraries offered for this framework and also on Linux, Swift frameworks, being able to be run on Linux is still limited, I would say. There's not going to be as many options as there would have been if choosing another language or another web framework. We've been writing a lot of packages, stuff like error reporting, stack traces, XML parsing, pagination, a lot of things you might expect coming from a web framework, or at least being offered by the community when choosing another web framework. To summarize, so it's a new language, it's a new package manager, it's a new framework. We have the love-hate, I have the love-hate relationship to Xcode. There's the limited options when it comes to hosting, and also there's going to be less libraries compared to other web frameworks. But let's try and compare this to other languages, to other web frameworks. So I did some quick research, and if we look at programming languages, I took some of the most popular ones. So we have JavaScript, we have Java, we have Ruby, and we have Swift. So JavaScript has been around for 22 years, and Swift have been around for 3 years. When we talk about web frameworks, and this is since their 1.0 release, We have Spring MVC for Java, we have Ruby on Rails, and we have Express for Node.js, and we have 3 of the 4 Swift web frameworks I mentioned earlier. Again, going from 15 years down to 1 year. Looking at these statistics, it kind of make me think that the future is bright for server-side Swift development. I think we've come a long way in a short amount of time, and I'm overall very optimistic about the future of server-side Swift development. Let's jump back to our timeline. So Swift became open source in December 2015, and around 9 months later, we saw 1.0 releases of 3 of the 4 big web frameworks I mentioned earlier. And this was together with the Swift 3 release. I also quickly want to mention that Kitura, IBM framework, came out with a 2.0 release 1 week ago. And I think we're going to see an alpha release of Vapor in just around the corner. But let's have a quickly look at how these frameworks managed to go from more or less nothing to a proper 1.0 release in around 9 months. So Kitura is run by IBM. IBM has been really good at advocating Swift on the server. They've been really good at contributing to the port of the standard library for Linux. We have Perfect, which is backed by a Canadian agency, and they also raised a bunch of money through VC funding. We have Vapor, which is also backed by an European agency called Nodes. I want to take a step back and finally and formally introduce myself. My name is Steffen. Throughout my life as a developer, I've been doing a lot of different things, and at some point I realized that I really liked iOS. So somehow I managed to overcome the Objective-C learning curve. I started to become a fan of iOS. I was a big fan of the release of Swift, and I ended up doing iOS development for years, doing bigger and smaller apps. But at some point, I started to think that it was maybe more Swift I was so passionate about and not necessarily iOS. And slowly it became clear to me that it was more the language than the platform I was liking the most. So after realizing that, I started looking into the different frameworks. I tried out Perfect, I tried out Kitura, and lastly I tried out Vapor. And I kind of decided to focus on Vapor. I liked the Swifty syntax, I liked the features it came with. It was all I needed at that point. And lastly, I really liked the community, really active and really welcoming. Just to give you an idea for those who might not have tried Vapor at all, this is a very simple snippet. It's taken from the Vapor front page. It shows you how to set up a web server and serve one endpoint in not a lot of lines of code. So I started messing around with Vapor, and at a very early stage, I brought up this discussion on the Vapor repo, talking about how do we share code across iOS and Backend, because this was one of the first things I started to care about. A couple of months later, and a bit by coincidence, I joined Nodes to kind of help start their Vapor team and kind of try to move all of their Backend development into Vapor. So I came with a primary background in iOS, and I realized that it's not the same when you're doing iOS development and when you're doing Vapor development. I want to highlight some of the differences I have encountered throughout the last 10 months. These are not a one-size-fits-all. It's more like observations, I would say. It might not fit to every use case, but general observation, I think you'll get the idea. Also want to point out that I'm not saying that one platform is better than the other. I'm just trying to give you an idea about the differences if you're coming from one platform to the other. All right, let's dive in. So number of users. On iOS, 1. So we can talk about logging in, logging out. We can talk about having multiple users logged in at the same time. But if we talk about the number of users that interact with your app right now in the palm of your hand, it's most of the time going to be 1 user. When you go to the backend, you kind of have to have a different mindset. I'm not going to bring up architectural patterns or good design decisions, but you're not going to see in the backend any global variables holding the currently logged in user. you kind of need to resolve everything based on the request. You're going to be hit by a lot of requests all the time, and you need to you're kind of limited to that request to figure out what you need to do. Performance. This is a bold one, I would say. Not an issue. So this is obviously not true. There's going to be different cases depending on what kind of application you're doing. But I think most of the time we are pretty spoiled in when we talk about performance on iOS. As soon as you hit the backend, you're going to run into bottlenecks really fast. You need to worry about performance. I think one of the biggest bottlenecks you're going to run into is the database. And if you don't know much about database, this is something where you can save a lot of time, where you can get a lot of performance boost by learning about databases. Also, as I mentioned earlier, if we talk about performance, we talk about memory consumption, it's going to cost you more money when you deploy it to a cloud solution. Crash handling. On iOS, we'll fix it in the next app update. So yes, we do have expedite reviews, and there might be other ways you can come around it, but there is overall an upper limit set by Apple, and there's also this kind of overall way of thinking that we'll bundle things together, we'll fix it in the next app update, we'll fix some bugs, we'll probably introduce some features, probably gonna do some 2 weeks release cycles, or maybe even less frequent, but that's the overall idea. Where when you hit the backend, it's more like, we can fix it right now, we can deploy it, we can ship it right now. So you might need to consider setting up some proper processes for doing testing and before you release stuff. But depending on where you work and depending on your team, you will have people saying, why not just hit the button right now, because we can do it. Platforms. If we talk about purely iOS development, there's only going to be one platform. You might do macOS, watchOS, whatever OS, but if we talk about iOS, there's only going to be one. If we talk about Vapor development right now, or server-side Swift development, you at least need to consider these two platforms. So I think the majority of the server-side Swift developers right now will be developing on a Mac computer, but as soon as they want to deploy it, it's going to be run on Linux. So you need to consider that. Foundation. On iOS, no worries. Use whatever you want, go crazy. As soon as you go to server-side Swift development or Vapor development, you kind of need to consider when you use Foundation, and you need to check that it's actually being ported to Linux. The Xcode project file. On iOS, it can be a merge madness, I would say. There's some tools that try to solve it. I haven't found a tool that just works all the time. Whereas on the server, you're gonna not having to worry about it at all. So we use the Swift package manager that generates the Xcode project file all the time, so we don't check in the Xcode project file. It's being regenerated all the time. Third-party frameworks on iOS. There's a bunch of them. So iOS has been around for a longer time. Swift has been available for iOS for a longer time. The community is bigger, so there's going to be a lot of them. Whereas on the backend side of it, and maybe more Vapor side of it, you kind of need to be prepared to roll out your own if it's not already there. User interfaces. On iOS, storyboards, auto layout, whatnot. When you hit the backend, it's more HTML, CSS, JavaScript, template languages. I'm not saying one is better than the other, but it's definitely two different worlds. Persistence. I think this is a rather bold one as well. I am saying that it's used to some extent. We have a lot of options when it comes to persistence on iOS. Depending on your use case, depending on your application, you might choose something that's more complex or more simple. We do some migrations, we do some queries, but I think when we talk about backend development, it's kind of, again, a different mindset, a different world, because it's really used heavily. Coming back to performance issues, it's going to be one of your biggest bottlenecks. So super difficult to design flexible databases. It can be difficult to do the proper queries, handling seedings, migrations, and so on. Security. I would say that it's mostly handled by the OS. You might need to consider your URL schemes you're using. You might need to add certificate pinning. But overall, I think we feel pretty safe as iOS developers working on that platform. When it comes to the web, I think you need to take it into account from day one. You need to consider where you're going to deploy it, what kind of service it's running. You need to consider the framework and what that framework is doing for you and not doing. And you need to consider your own implementation and if you need to consider security. Consumers. So unless you're going to do a SDK or a library, you're not going to have other developers consuming your code. You might collaboratively work on the same project team, but you're not going to have people trying to call your code, basically. Whereas if you're going to do APIs, you're going to be asked, you're going to hear this a lot. So you need to care about your consumers, you need to document your APIs, you need to gracefully handle changes in the APIs. Releasing iOS, you're going to file provisioning profiles, you're going to accept terms, you're going to accept some more terms, and you're going to make your customer accept some terms. And when it comes to backend, it's more about deploying what to what environment on what solution. I hope this gave a somewhat idea of the differences coming from iOS to Vapor, and some of these are straightforward, some of these are more challenging, and I want to give you some 10 quick concrete tips on how to overcome some of these. First up, read the documentation and get involved. I think one of the biggest upsides to Vapor right now is the community. So don't be afraid to get on Slack at a very early stage and start engaged with people, even though you are still very new. Learn about databases. So Vapor has official support. It supports a lot of different database technologies, but one they support officially is MySQL, so that might be a good starting point. Consider learning about MySQL. Consider when to use Foundation. So every time you do import Foundation, there should be a little person in your head with a flag saying, is this really necessary? And if it is, consider looking up, see if it's really ported. You don't want to spend days or weeks making this nice feature for your application, and then when you ship it and you deploy it, then it doesn't run on Linux. It's super frustrating. Also, I think Vapor did a really good job of exposing or offering the same functionality which hasn't been ported to Linux. So check if Vapor has something similar you can use. Start reporting. Use a bug reporting tool such as Bugsnag. We use that to kind of gather all the bug reports. Use a logging tool such as SwiftDebeaver so you know what's going on as soon as you deploy your project. This goes for a lot of different types of software projects, but definitely consider, since you're dealing with macOS and Linux, so set up CI or set up a virtual machine so it's easy and fast for you to compile your project on Linux. We use Circle CI 2.0, which came out quite recent, I would say, and we were able to get the build times on Linux to a very we managed to make our build times very low, and all of our configuration files are in the open. Definitely piggyback on that. I know that Vapor is also using Circle CI. You can piggyback on that. You don't have to invent the setup yourself. Consider writing API tests. So you might already be doing unit tests, integration tests, UI tests. But when you do backend development, consider maybe doing API tests, maybe doing like more proper black box testing from the outside of your code base. Use a tool like Postman to actually hit the environment and see, just by using requests and looking at the responses. Document your APIs. I think that goes without saying. You're probably gonna have consumers, and it's gonna save you a lot of time by spending time in the early stage documenting your APIs. Use a tool for it, Postman, Swagger. Consider how you deal with security. There's some stuff built into Vapor. They have cores, but there's also A guy called Tim Condon, he did a package called security headers, which is also very promising. I will look into that. Look up the template language you're going to use. Maybe you're going to use Leaf if we talk about Weber. See what it is offering and make sure to utilize it, and don't fight the template language. Lastly, I want to mention that if you're going to do Weber, I would recommend using Weber Cloud. So it's very, very similar to Heroku. It's just built using Weber and for Weber projects. So they're able to do some more optimizations, some more niceness, because they know you're going to deploy Weber projects. All right, I want to spend the last time of this presentation looking at the last 10 months of making this switch. So Nodes did PHP, Laravel, backend development, and they made the switch to server-side Swift development using Weber. So these are some of the challenges we've faced. There's lots of moving targets. So the Swift language, the Swift package manager, we have the Weber framework, we have Weber Cloud, migration pains, breaking changes, depending on third-party packages and the ripple effects when something breaks, and you depend on all the other packages being updated before you can benefit from the new Weber update. Overhead in creating and maintaining open source packages. So we like doing open source. We've been doing a lot of open source, but there's also a balance. We are an app agency. We need to deliver projects as well. And there has definitely been a lot of overhead in creating and maintaining these packages. We've seen a lot of lack of documentation, stuff not being documented, but also maybe not just exemplified good enough. I mentioned this earlier, outdated resources. Because everything is moving this fast right now, we see that resources are being outdated really fast, and it just makes it harder to get into the framework. Since the community has been small, there's been few experts, so fewer people to talk to and ask about the problems you might face. I think in Weber 1 we saw a lot of boilerplate. I think that kind of adds to annoyance, but also to, it just takes more time to build, basically. Christoph had a nice talk about Sorcery earlier today. We recently started using Sorcery pretty heavily, and even though in Weber 2 there's less boilerplate, we use Sorcery to eliminate the rest of it. And it's working really, really well. There's some Linux quirkiness. I already mentioned stuff not being ported, so not exposed, not available in Foundation, but also a minor thing like stack traces. It's something I totally took for granted when I did iOS development. You don't get it right now on Linux, and it's just a huge pain, and it's one of the biggest rabbit holes we fell into when we tried to make stack traces work on Linux again. There's the Linux main file a lot of people have been writing about, which again all adds up to some Linux quirkiness you need to understand and work around. Let's see how things have improved. I think updates are slowing down. I think we saw that with Swift 4, and I think we're going to see that with Weber 3 and also moving ahead. I think they're going to kind of follow the same pattern as Swift is doing right now. Weber Cloud reached 1.0 quite recently, and it's stable. We have all of our projects in Weber Cloud, and it works really well. Even though we really like creating open source packages, we don't do it as much anymore because the tools we need is already there. The documentation is improving. It's on GitHub. I encourage all developers to pitch in to improve the documentation even further. We see more and more resources. We see the community is growing. I think Tanner Nelson, one of the authors of Weber, announced at Try Swift that the number 4,000 member on Slack just joined recently. So we see more people, more active people. I already mentioned this, but there's less boilerplate, and I think Swift on Linux is more mature as well. So how have we been using this? So we have right now running in production using Weber, running on Weber Cloud. We have 25 customer projects. We've created more than 30 open source packages for Weber. We see that our hosting fees are going down, coming back to the memory footprint earlier. We see that more and more of our iOS developers start to catch up, and we are as I mentioned earlier, again, we're able to kind of shift people around. I think we develop faster in Weber now than we did 10 months ago. But also comparing server-side Swift or Weber projects to the Laravel projects we had earlier, we see less bugs than before. But I think more importantly, there haven't really been any major issues since we did this switch. And I think that's pretty impressive. Some resources, the Weber documentation, the Weber Slack, the stuff we do for Weber, and the last item on the list is a talk by Gianluca at the SwiftConf. He did a more general server-side Swift State of the Union kind of talk where he compared all the different frameworks and where we are today. I think if you're more interested in the different frameworks and how it's going in general, I would encourage you to look at that talk. I'll be around. Any questions around Swift or server-side Swift or Weber or CATS or whatever, then ping me and we can talk about it. Thank you.